Um, I'm so thankful to Steve Astoria for everything that he does with John Battles leading our science advisory panel on the workforce. Steve leads the climate hub out here for the Federal Department of Agriculture, and he does an excellent job moderating these panels to help us understand where we're at, again, the challenges and opportunities. So over to you, Dr. Astoria.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kristen, for that break, because I was still working with the comment that scientists don't agree and aren't on time. So that kind of calmed me down. I am a scientist. I run the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Climate Hub for California. There are now 11 climate hubs across the nation, including an international climate hub. We are a service organization that works with our partners, all of our partners, to better assimilate climate change information into their planning. And like all of you, I did take how to manage natural and working lands with an accelerated climate by 150 times historic levels in college, so I'm well prepared. I'm obviously kidding. None of us took that class. We're all figuring it out as we go, and this is the way to do it. So what we're going to do, I have no idea how to change the slides. Copy that. What we're going to do here is, you've heard this at a really lovely high level, a course level. We're going to hone in. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation in plain terms with scientists. We're going to do that. And we're going to tell you about some of the things at a finer resolution that you told us through some of our efforts to understand what was important to you, what that means in terms of the nuts and bolts science, but how that relates to wildfire and to climate change and that relationship. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So in many ways, Northern California, it kind of represents the vital organs of the state. Some of the richest areas biodiversity-wise in carbon stocks, like nowhere else in California, quite honestly. You can see in the photo of those redwood trees. You are supplying water to the rest of the state. This is the largest agricultural producing on a subnational level region in all of the world. We move more water than anywhere else on Earth in California. And a lot of that starts right here. And it's dependent on healthy watersheds. For a lot of reasons. The salmon run, it's the veins, if you will, of this region, the streams and the rivers, and the biodiversity and the cultural importance of things like free-running salmon to many of the native peoples that live here. But we have wildfire. We have wildfire that, as Downer Doug shared with us, and we're gonna warm up to you. We're gonna be buying beers for you later. He's right. They're right at the footsteps of our communities, like we've never seen before. And we, as a composite of scientists, realize that we are running out of time. But the way that this task force has articulated an approach from the bottom up, you all, to the top down in terms of support and resources, is the way that we're going to get there. And I'm convinced, I'm very much all in. Patrick is one of the few people that no matter when he calls, I make a point to answer it. The other is my mom, I'll share, in case she's watching, which is true. Because we're really gonna get there this way, and the world is watching. And it's not lost on me that a Washington office representative for the Wildlife Crisis Strategy is here. This is very much top on their priority list. So this photo, as you can see, is of the 2020 August complex fire. Climate change, it's not just warming. We just don't have longer, more severe droughts. We also have a drying of the atmosphere. That increase of what we call vapor pressure deficit makes things drier. It pulls moisture out of the fuels. So we start to see fires more and more that are burning like that one, up into the crowns of these forested systems, leaving our landscapes largely denuded in many cases. And you can see what that looks like in terms of a historical perspective. So that map in the middle of your screen shows wildfire activity for the last 114 years. And those big blobs in red are the fires that have occurred in the last 5 years. That should be alarming. And when we were exchanging these maps, preparing for this event, the scientists on our team, you're hearing things like, "Oh crap," "Oh my God," and you could just go on with that, right? But this is alarming. But this is how we're going to turn that to the direction of getting appropriate use of fire on these landscapes. And as I shared, this is what we're left with. We're left with conditions that are really difficult to manage in a post-fire context. And that, as I mentioned before, this translates to those ecological values: the water, the biodiversity, the carbon, the recreation. Most of us are, I'm sure, are forest recreation users as well. So as Secretary Crowfoot shared, I and Dr. John Battles here to my right, we co-chair the Science Advisory Panel. One of the beautiful aspects of this design, of this task force, is that they really want to ensure that what they're putting out there is vetted. There's a consensus by and large by an independent body of scientists. You can see them on the list, 3 of which are on this panel here with me today, including Julianne down the line there from PSW. We really grapple with these issues. So it's not just like, hey, let's do this, let's put this out. Patrick comes to his science advisory panel and other members of the executive committee and the work groups to ensure that what we're putting out there for you to use is in fact vetted and the best available science in terms of the resources and tools that are being designed. Oh, really? All right, screwed it. Thank you. One more, yeah, thank you. I did my best. So these you've seen. I think it's okay to see some things twice, because for many of us, we're working on this, we're in work group meetings weekly, multiple hours within a week, right? So we know this, we want to appreciate this. We want to now share it with you. So the way that this session has been designed to hear from these scientists, which we'll do in just a moment, is that picture up on your left, that's a challenge, is the regional profile for Northern California. It's a publicly available resource. It has incorporated the best available science related to key outcomes and values that you all have voiced to one of our Climate Hub postdocs that put that together, and that was no trivial exercise. So kudos to Chelsea for that, for getting that done. That then is a complement, a primer in a way, to the regional resource kits that Patrick mentioned. And you can see, and Dr. John Battles here to my right, he's really, with Peter Stein and others, have really been instrumental in meeting those timelines. And there it has been stressful, but they have done that. You can use that QR code. I believe it still works to access those things. They're the same things that Patrick spoke of, and we're going to kind of use this session through individual vignettes, if you will, related to those regional profiles to highlight some of the things that you all thought were valuable. And then we're going to transition to John, and he's going to really dig into what these regional resource kits and the tracking system looks like. I guess it's the assessment, rather, excuse me. So we have a wonderful panel assembled for you today. We have Dr. Ramona Butts. She's an ecologist with the Region 5 Ecology Program. She is a resident here in Northern California. We also have Dr. Frank Lake. He is going to be talking to us about fire use and indigenous and cultural stewardship. We have Safiq Khan, who I've known for many, many years when we were both down in Central California. Safiq's an expert on explaining and understanding the role of land management activities on those kind of water processes and services that you're providing for the rest of the state. And we'll finish up with Jana Valakovic, who is also a resident of your region, and she'll be talking to us about community resilience and protection. So with that, I want to invite Ramona to the screen, or to the podium, and we'll get going. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Oh. Stay here.
You're welcome to present either there or
Okay. I'm going to stay here. Thank you, Steve. So I have the pleasure this morning of introducing you to some of the ecosystems and fire regimes in Northern California. And I'm going to start with a little bit about diversity of place. And Steve alluded to this already, but I think this is one of the most diverse areas in California. And so I've got a couple of example photos and rough locations of where those are located in the state. This first picture is of what is often referred to as the Miracle Mile. So this is the area of highest conifer diversity that we know of in the world. 18 species of conifers have been identified in 1 square mile so far, and this is in the Russian wilderness on the Klamath National Forest. We also have chaparral, somewhat similar to Southern California. And I pulled this picture from the southern end of the Mendocino National Forest. So very different systems, very different fire regimes, which we're going to talk a little bit about. This is mixed evergreen forest from the Six Rivers area where I reside in Eureka. And then we also have really incredible meadow systems. This is actually Plaskett Meadows on the Mendocino National Forest after the August complex. And 2 more, Darlingtonia fens. So one of the reasons that we have really high biodiversity and a variety of ecosystems in California is because of our geography, our topography and our geology. And so Darlingtonia fens occur mostly on serpentine. These are really endemic, unique communities. And then, of course, last but not least, we have redwoods. And so this is from Avenue of the Giants, just a sampling of a diverse variety of places. And I had to be restrained from adding a bunch more photos. So here's a different perspective of some of these dominant ecosystems. As you can see from this map, we have a really diverse array of ecosystems in Northern California. These are reduced down into sort of large common categories. But as you can see, both of those greens are forested lands, conifer forest, forested lands, and then the orange, I believe, is hardwood. So that's your oak woodlands and other things. So that comprises most of Northern California. I also want to point out, and the colors on here are a little bit different, but the red is an urban area. And as you can see, there's very little urban area in all of Northern California here. So we have a little bit of the northern portion of the Bay Area. And then, Redding and Eureka Arcata are 2 of the bigger cities. And so I think I have my numbers right. Eureka and Arcata combined about 46,000 people. And Redding, I think, is sitting at around 93,000. So this is a really large landscape with people spread out very sparsely across this whole area. And I also want to point out here, which we're going to talk a little bit more in the next couple of slides, historically, most of this area, most of this forested area had a fire return interval. So that means the number of years between fires on that same piece of land, on that same piece of ground, of approximately 10 to 20 years. So this is what we call a frequent fire system. Let's see. So this map here depicts where we don't have enough wildfire on this landscape from historical perspective, and where we have too much fire. And so I want to point out that, so the warm colors on here are too little fire. And I think this is very different than what folks that saw the Southern California presentation would have seen. The areas where we do have too much fire on this map are typically higher elevation areas and those chaparral systems, kind of on the southern and eastern end, the drier zones. So most of this forested community is actually not seeing as much fire as we would have anticipated historically. So what are frequent fire forests? Frequent fire forests mean this is relatively frequent low severity fire. So your dry mixed conifer forest might burn every 10 to 12 years. Those are systems that a lot of you probably drove through on the way here. And this low severity, frequent fire maintains these really open forests. It provides resilience to drought and to insect attacks, and it really moderates fire behavior. And so this is what we would have historically seen in many of our forested systems. And I think this is what many of us as scientists would like to somehow, not necessarily go back to, but figure out some analog for in the future. So As I mentioned, these are communities that live with fire, and I do think I mislabeled this one. I believe, and some of you from the Shasta Trinity can correct me, this was the Wonder Fire from last year, and I believe this is the community of Bridge Bay on the left of this photo. And I also wanted to highlight that I'm not going to speak to wildlife issues and wildlife with fire, but really wanted to note that that is something that as a scientific community, we are also thinking about and considering, just limited to time. And so historically, in these areas, this would have been mostly fire from cultural burning from indigenous communities and lightning fires. The map, which is part of the resource kit that John's going to talk about, shows ignition sources, and these are driven largely by roadways. And so I really wanted to show this graphic because all of those little red lines are our major road systems in Northern California. And so you can really see where those human ignition sources are. The green areas in between those are also where most of the people don't live. And so it's really an interesting landscape in terms of, just the remoteness and the distribution of communities in this area, as many of you who are from here know. And so, as we've also talked a little bit about, and I think Safik will speak to further, we have most of the water in Northern California. So this abundance of water leads to really productive forests and frequent growth. And so this is resulting in very dense forests with too much fuel in them. We're growing this stuff every year. This is one of our fire challenges, as it is throughout the state of California. We're also dealing with climate change. So the picture here is of climate change-induced drought. And under drought in California, our trees don't receive as much water. They're competing for water. So the more dense that our forests are, the harder it is for them to get water. We're going to see potential mortality events from that and, dieback. So you have a density problem. We also have, interestingly, with climate change in Northern California, atmospheric rivers, and these boom and bust cycles of wet and dry years are really being exacerbated under climate change. And so those give us very interesting challenges from both perspectives of how to maintain and manage these forests for resilience. And as I mentioned already, access here is really tricky. Getting to some of these fires where they start. This is remote, rugged country. So these are just a few highlights of challenges that we have with fire in California. So I know there's a little bit on this graphic, but I'm using a map of the Mendocino National Forest. That is the map on the right, and high severity fire is shown in red, and the lowest severity or unburned areas are in green. And so this map is just a combination of the August fire from 2020 and the ranch fire from 2018. And it shows a real interesting diversity and some of the challenges that we are facing as land managers across this region. If you're from the Mendocino National Forest, that is a really daunting map to look at and think about, how do we come back from these fires that have really just occurred in the last 5 years. So what do we know about fire? We know that most of the areas in Northern California, which I think goes counter to what some people might think, we're still in a deficit. We don't have enough frequent fire on these landscapes. But we are getting larger fires, and these larger fires are becoming more frequent. And then those patches of high severity are also getting bigger. So that's what you can see in these large areas of red on the maps. And that creates issues for regeneration of natural forests. That knocks out your seed sources, so you don't have seeds for your trees, makes regeneration really challenging. So questions that we're still asking as scientists: how do we deal with all of these changing complexities? So, we have exacerbations from climate change. We have changes in seasonality of our fires. We have fires starting earlier. I don't even know if there is a fire season anymore, actually. Much earlier in the year to much later in the year. And our patch sizes are very complex. And so these are all really big challenges that we are still thinking about. But it's not all doom and gloom. I want to leave you with one last slide. And this is still the map of the Mendocino, just here for context, and some of the regenerating forest. So when we get these really, really large fires, they're not all moonscapes. We don't have, completely burned landscapes that we must start from scratch on. There is so much good fire that is coming out of some of these larger fires, even though they are hard for us to look at as communities and to live with as communities in this landscape. So with that, I will turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramona. It's a perfect transition, and now we're going to go to Dr. Frank Lake with Pacific Southwest Research, who will talk more on the application of fire, so we can change that from too large and too much of it being at high severity to not having a burn pattern that results in low to moderate severity and different applications of fire. Dr. Lake.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the invitation and the welcome from our Win2 host. Also, I want to let you know, in addition to being a Forest Service scientist, I'm a Karuk descendant. My half siblings are Yurok, so I've been growing up in Humboldt County and culturally participate, and that informs a lot of the science I'll be sharing with you. Thank you. So when we talk about fire use, this is kind of in addition to just managing wildland fire or wildfires, is the bulk of what we have here in the North State is primarily by the USDA Forest Service, implementing prescribed fire control burns, followed by the Bureau of Land Management, and then the Park Service, although each of them have different agency or department directives and goals for the way that they use fire. Also commensurate with that, or common, is also from the state level. We have CAL FIRE as one of the leaders in that. And another component from this state is the Parks and Recreation, using fire for a lot of ecological and biodiversity components. And then to our tribal partners, there's within the tribal governments, there's tribal wildland fire departments that also engage in suppression and management of wildfires, but also are ramping up and working with partners such as state and federal and other entities that I'll mention on increasing prescribed fire with cultural objectives. And that ties and links into many of the tribal organizations and individuals such as cultural practitioners who are looking to work with these other entities on increasing fire use. And then where a lot of my work started as a scientist and working with the basket weavers over there in Humboldt County was with the initial Fire Safe Council over there. And that was a big start coming way back in the early mid 2000s. And we see now with the development of the prescribed fire associations, these are multi-cooperative entities coming together to conduct burns on single, but also multiple jurisdictions. And that's where we really gain our benefit. So one of the things to touch on that was really important, I think, too, and mirrors the ecology and the other diversity that we have here, is indigenous stewardship, or the management of those resources in traditional homelands. Those approaches and processes are about as diversified as the ecosystems, the various habitats, and those fire regimes. And I'll talk more about the fire regimes and those species that are culturally used across those areas. Fire use can be generally defined as prescribed fire, which often might be just for fire risk reduction or for reducing hazardous fuels. But we see also this growing expansion of those goals around prescribed fire with cultural objectives, which is a lot of that work coming from and led by the tribes with their indigenous knowledge, linking how and why fire could be a greater resource to achieve what we want for resilience. And that can also very much differ by the geographies. And so a lot of those areas, if you see this map here, shows a variety of the traditional territories and the linguistic diversity across that region. And that in itself across this landscape is an important component of adding historical fire use, but also fire use moving into the future. And with that, I want to come in and got to know a little bit better the tribal nature-based solutions aspect of the state and its various initiatives and programs. Look into that, because that's going to be a way to help bring people together across jurisdictions and a way to look at how we meld cultural as well as with ecological values moving forward with fire. So essentially, from a tribal perspective, that's been shared with me, is that fire is medicine. Living here within a fire-prone ecosystem, we're relying upon many fire-dependent species that are tied to those fire regimes. And out of that cultural adaptation to both climate and those fire regimes came to form fire-dependent cultures. And I think that's at the core of this part about indigenous knowledge and stewardship, is to understand this long, evolved process of living with fire and climate in our area that we can learn from our indigenous partners. A component of that, we've talked about natural fire regimes are lightning. Often indigenous fire, and desired in the past as well as today, increases the frequency or the diversity of the seasons within fire. That seasonality, we see sometimes now having to do more spring or early summer burns as a way of an initial fire or corrective fire, but then some of those systems or ecosystems and resources would be more of a fall or late fall fire regime, and looking at that. Often that specificity is tied to the resources of cultural interest, particularly basket material, foods, wildlife habitat, and then tied to that, as you hear from many tribal partners, is that responsibility for fire use. These often link very much to some of those historical management goals. Again, some of the things around food and basketry materials, important medicinal resources, or even that philosophical aspect that fire is medicine, and tie into many of the ritual and ceremonial parts of tribal culture. Those link to contemporary management goals, some of which are new and novel, but are creating additional challenges, but also time and opportunity there, is to look at reforestation, our post-fire recovery, generally how we do our restoration approaches as informed by indigenous and Western knowledge, looking at the wildlife habitat, whether they're cultural keystone species or conservation species of concerns, and now very much what we see for climate change and for invasive species and other forms of disturbance. And those link into some of the contemporary cultural goals as well. Some of the reasons for partnering, we see this through both federal and state directives and policies, and working at the government level, especially for consultation, and then looking at state and federal departments or agencies and programs to be able to move that forward. And a lot of this work will happen and take place on the ground at the crew level or person to person, and that's one way that we can look at empowering indigenous stewardship and fire use. Some of these approaches, we look at supporting. No? Nope. I don't know. Okay, my cell phone's away. Doesn't count towards my 2 minutes? All right. Got about 20 more slides. Hey. Just thinking I need my fourth cup of coffee. All right, I'll continue on in the interest of time if you can hear me. So, a lot of this is bringing Western indigenous knowledge together to specifically inform our treatment strategies across the landscape, but even down to the treatment units, how we go about mechanical and manual treatments in there in the different areas, and how we specify that. This example features the restoration of a culturally significant species, California black oak. We're looking at restoration byproduct of Douglas fir as a way to restore that, and then bringing back prescribed fire with cultural objectives. In this example, of a prescribed fern with the Yurok Cultural Fire Management Council. The takeaway from this slide is that we can start in areas that basically are overdense, overstocked, highly vulnerable forest types. And so if we look at what is considered a poor resource area on the lower left, it's going to take multiple treatments to get to a point to fostering and facilitating collaborative partnerships that lead towards more stewardship and local-based management. The treatments are a variety of things that you can do there, plus the RX is the fire, followed by silvicultural approaches, and then eventually we can get to the point of managing this and these systems into the future as fire-dependent cultures living within our fire-prone areas. So that's a lot of the work we have there. And the icons talk about increasing like nut and basketry and food materials there, moving towards higher resistance for drought-tolerant fire-adapted species. And in this last part, really here in working in partnership, these can be strategies for assisting climate change by promoting resistance and resilience of both our human communities and our environment working together. So tribes are beneficiaries as well as the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And just to be crystal clear, these are fire-dependent systems with communities and cultures that rely on that fire. We don't want the fire to go away. We need the fire. It's part of the system. It will help us reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires. And when we have those wildfires, those are the events that put the resources that we're reliant on societally for domestic, agricultural, industrial uses like water, let alone hydroelectric generation, at risk. And now we have one of my colleagues from UC Merced, Dr. Safiq Khan, who will speak to that aspect of these ecosystems. Safiq?
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so I presume we are all sitting in the room from California, so I'm not going to offend anyone if you're not from California, and I'm going to say this. Okay, move slide. Sorry. It never work. Okay. So advance this way. This is okay. All right. So I'm gonna really, start with stating the obvious that we're really blessed to be living in California and calling this home. There aren't many places throughout the world that are like California, climatologically speaking. And there are only 4 other places, if you look on the map, that look like California, right? And this is what really makes possible that we can support 39 million people in the state, and we can support $50 billion agriculture industry and everything else that comes with it. So this is really a unique place. And I would also like to remind everyone that we have this immense hydrologic variability throughout the state. So this is, California is probably one of the biggest states if you think in terms of the latitude that we cover. So climatologically, it has its own set of challenges. We have a lot of water, but it's not at the right place or at the right time. And just to throw some numbers, a quarter of the state produces over 3/4 of our water supply. And most of that water supply comes from the Sierra Nevada, as well as this region where we are sitting today, in Northern California. The Northern California in particular, and again, I'm probably going to offend few people in the room, but we often refer Sierra Nevada as our water tower. And that might be true for the consumptive water use, but when you think in terms of the total water supply that comes from different regions in the state, Northern California is the region that produces most water supply, consumptive use plus the water that we use for protecting the environment and everything else. So this is truly, in true sense, is our water tower for the state, this region, Northern California. And of course, this region supplies the water to the Central Valley Project. So Trinity Lake is the 3rd biggest reservoir in the state, that stores about 2.5 million acre-feet of water that feeds into the Central Valley Project that goes to Southern California. Both supplies water for agriculture as well as for the urban water use. This region is also hydrologically very productive. We get a lot of precipitation. The precipitation here is highest in the state, on average about 1,000 millimeter a year. And as a result of that, the runoff is nearly twice, on per unit area basis as compared to the Sierra Nevada. So it's hydrologically very productive region, but it has its own set of challenges. This region doesn't receive much snowpack in the winter, so we have a prolonged summer drought. So even though we get a lot more rainfall, this region experienced one of the longest, dry and hot summer, and so everything that comes with that. Wildfire, drought, and tree mortality, dead and riverbed and stream beds. So, and I'm going to highlight a couple more things that is really specific to this region. Is I think Ramona mentioned how productive this region is when it comes to ecosystem productivity, the above ground biomass. So the forest in the Northern California, the above ground biomass is twice as much what we got in the Sierra Nevada on a per unit area basis. So we have too much biomass sitting above ground. And you might be thinking, awesome, that's a lot of carbon, right? But that's only part of the story, right? If you have too much biomass sitting and if you have prolonged summer drought and hot temperatures, it's really a perfect recipe for disaster, right? So no surprise, every time when we get wildfire in this region, it burns hot, it burns bigger, right? So yes, we have more carbon, but that carbon is not sustainable over the long term. So thinking in terms of how we can make this forest resilient, make this forest carbon sequester over a long term, not thinking in terms of short-term gains, right? And I'm going to point one more thing here: the role of coastal fog, right? Coastal fog is super critical because, as I said, this region doesn't receive much snowpack, right? So the only resistance against the summer drought, right, is the coastal fog, and the coastal fog is moving in the opposite direction. It's not really helping this part, right? The coastal fog makes the dry season a little bit milder. Coastal fog keeps the wildfire risk minimum, but that fog is moving away. So that was our only defense in this region, not having the snowpack, and that is diminishing over time. The snowpack, this is what we describe the snow at risk region, right? So it basically means that the snowfall in this region comes anywhere between plus minus 2 degrees Celsius. So thinking in terms of the future climate, warmer climate, this is the region that will get hit hard, right? So you can see all this, the map on the area on the map that's shown in red, we will very likely lose all of that snowpack pretty soon. It only requires a couple of degrees of temperature warming in Celsius. So whatever little bit of snowpack we have, it's not going to last very long into the future. So what's the impact of losing snowpack? So this is one of the data slides, or one of the few data slides that I have. What we are seeing is that as you shift from snow-dominated system to rain-dominated system, so the rivers are sourcing a lot more sediment from upslope, right? So they're no more relying on local source of sediments, from the stream banks and so on and so forth. So the sediment sources are shifting, and with that, they're bringing a lot more coarser sediment, because the rain can generate a lot more coarser sediment than the snowmelt. The snowmelt tends to drive fine sediment that is ecologically valuable and important. Coarser sediment is bad both for the river ecology as well as our water infrastructure. Wildfire is burning the above ground canopy, that is increasing the impact of rainfall and precipitation. So we are getting more and more runoff generated from these landscapes. Wildfire is also diminishing the root strength. So there's nothing that is holding the soil. So in a way that the wildfire is actually changing our river system, the hydrogeomorphic regime that is, again, ecologically bad. It's bad for our ecosystem, it's bad for our water infrastructure. There's a lot more sedimentation that is happening in our reservoirs. They're already losing capacity from more rain, compared to snowfall, and add the sedimentation on top of it, we have the double trouble that is really hitting our infrastructure. One more. Yeah, that's it.
Ramona, thank you, and Frank. That's just so. I learned so much of that. I'm ashamed to say this, but I learned so much on this. It's soft. So, but that's just fantastic. Love it.
Yes, it's on. Okay, thank you. We're gonna get rolling. Thank you, everyone. That is a social demonstration of adaptation. Even we can do it. So one of the things I love about Safik, and I've loved over the years, is there's nothing simple about water. There's actually everything complex. And it's also one of the words we see on the news now in the Western United States on the daily. And as I mentioned in my opening, this region, it's, like I said, it's one of the vital organs in doing that through the water that comes out of this region. So thank you, Safik. That was really, really great. Our last panelist is Jana Valakovic. She is going to be talking to us today about community resilience and protection.
Did you notice how he had to put the microphone down? Yes, thanks. Thanks for reminding me of my tallness. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. I'm Jana Valikovic. I work with the University of California in partnership with Humboldt and Del Norte counties, and I was born and raised in this region. So I want to welcome you. If this is the first time you've been to the North State, it's a real honor to have you here. If you are a resident here, it's good to see you today. I'm amazed how many people have come from the coast, so it's a real pleasure to see you. And if you used to live here, welcome back. I hope you stay. So what I am going to do today is talk about how the biophysical connects to what I'm going to call the biosocial. Really how place defines culture and how culture is informed by place. So where I'm from, people really identify with their watershed. Like, you're from the Mattole, you're from the Salmon River, you're from the Smith, you're from the Eel. We think in those ways, and I don't know that that is as common in other places in California, but it is an interesting way to identify. You know, we are very much Northern California, we're proud about that, and we have some fierce individualism because of that, but that individualism is also informed by the communities in the space that we live in. So I've got this funny little map up here. Yes, we heard earlier from Ramona that we're mostly rural. And so let's look at that. So if you look at the other regions across California, on the middle panels, city locations by population size, and you really don't see any pink dots, do you? Right? This is a very rural geographic area. And it got me to wonder about post offices. Because post offices are essential places of gathering, and it's a place that I grew up in. You'd see your neighbors, you'd have conversation, and when you look at the density of population, what's interesting to me is that we have the same number of post offices per each of the other 4 regions in California, but we only have 4% of the population. And those post offices are struggling. So if you haven't gone to a post office, go visit them, please. They need our love. But it has created this, interesting dynamic in that we have the water, we have the forests, we have the carbon, and we have the fewest amount of people to steward those. And that really has an important impact in terms of workforce and in terms of our future and how we're going to live in this place. So let's look a little bit at the ownership structures too, just to sort of understand where we are. We are a mixture of public and private land. That's not anything different, but there is a vast quantity of private industrial and non-industrial forest land in this North State. And there are some interesting dynamics when you look at that that are worth understanding, because as we try to find solutions and place-based solutions, we have to understand what the population type looks like and what the demographics either create opportunity for or create limitation for. So there's a couple numbers in there. So the one in number 1 there, I just wanted to highlight Sonoma County. It's a community that is made up of small parcels, mostly 40-acre parcels. So finding solutions at scale means working with lots and lots and lots of people. When you move to the north, you can see both Humboldt and Mendocino counties, where there are also lots of small parcels, but there are a lot of mid-sized ranches. And what's unique about that respective to California is that there are more people that still live on their ranches. They're not hobby ranches. They really are not absentee ranches. They're people that still live on those. So they're land rich and cash poor. And they're really the backbone of those that are stewarding much of our resources. I want to just forecast looking or look a little bit farther north. You've got communities like Del Norte that are 80% publicly owned. There are fewer people to work with. There are fewer organizations to work with in that context. So that has some impact over our choices. I also want to bring forward the private forest land, and if I just want to look at the industrial forest land, because it got washed out in that earlier graphic, there is a huge opportunity to work with the private sector in this space. One of the other interesting factors is that there are lots of non-industrial landowners. In Humboldt County, of the private forest land, it's split about 50-50 with public and with industrial and non-industrial ownerships. That mirrors the state average, which is, I think, an important factor to take into consideration. So we are isolated and rugged, and our transportation networks, as Ramona said, really are defined by our mountains and rivers. And what I want to bring forward, a couple key ideas. So I grew up in outside of the community of Garberville. I was bused 2.5 hours each way to school, 5 hours a day. it takes a lot to maintain living in this ecosystem that we need to steward. I now live 100 miles away from where I was born. It's not too bad, really. But thinking about workforce and workforce retention and retaining our youth is complicated. Within our transportation network, which makes it difficult for us to get to places, we often get isolated. The road that I'm going to take home later today or tomorrow is normally about a 3-hour drive, and it's about 5 hours because of construction delays right now. That makes it difficult to deploy resources. That makes it difficult to get in goods and services. And so it also makes it difficult to bring in dual career couples and all of those things that are associated with that. But there's a hidden gem in here that I want to bring forward, and that is the port of Humboldt Bay. It is key as we start to talk about infrastructure and processing because it gets us into that short sea shipping. And there's a transportation highway that's off the coast that we always need to recognize, and that is going to be key for us to be able to expand our wood processing and our capacity in those regions. So just a little shout out to our friends on the Salmon River Road. This is much of what our road system looks like, and we've got rural communities, and I think Doug can, Downer Doug can appreciate how difficult it is for rural communities to be able to afford maintaining that road network and all of what goes with that. So as I start to wrap up here, we have some challenges and opportunities. And so let's think about this. So from a challenges perspective, we are workforce limited. We are pulling labor from other states, especially Oregon. When I put out forest management contracts, I more often get bidders from out of state than I do from within state because our in-state folks are just completely occupied. We have a fundamental problem in being able to retain our youth. And thinking about living in a rural place where you can't retain your youth is really significant. I am an anomaly. In Humboldt County, people are shocked that I'm actually from that community. It's great to welcome new people in, but it's hard to figure out how to make it work in a community that you didn't necessarily intend to live with a new family and all of those things. There's an element in cultural history that I want to bring forward, and that is that we are steeped in environmental conflict. And that really is the legacy that has driven regulations in California. And we're slowly getting through some of those issues, but that really has an impact in how we frame and look at the issues. There's so much distrust out there. We are also a product of a continual wave of resource extraction, from mining to timber to fishing, and I'll just add in cannabis in there. And we shouldn't forget about how much of that land base is impacted by cannabis. So as we move forward into the opportunity space, we have 2 California State University systems, that's Cal Poly Humboldt and Sonoma State, and we have many junior colleges, and it's a real pleasure to be here at Shasta College today, and I just want to give a shout out for the great work they do here, and Becky Lowe and others, because it's a really phenomenal program. On the cultural side, we're really proud of our regional differences, and we're really proud of our place-based strategies. So that is an opportunity. It's also a challenge. You cannot template what works in the Mattole and put it necessarily what works in the Russian River system, right? You really have to figure out how to energize and amplify the innovation space within community. And there's opportunities to learn from each other, but it's not easy to sort of template that across. So, we've heard some about the rich and wonderful history of tribal management, and we've got lots of great opportunity there, and I just really want to appreciate the cultural-based burning and really how we're getting to more fluency in that space. So let's talk a little bit about the resource extraction issue. I think the other good point in this is that people still really value blue-collar skills. There is a qualified workforce to some degree that's still here. We have a workforce in transition, and let me just identify, like, cannabis workers at this point are in transition. So that's some opportunity in some ways that we should be aware of. And there's also some really interesting co-governance structures and cross-boundary work that maybe we can dig into during the panel. Been getting the 1-minute thing, so I got 2 more slides to say. Here's a positive. There is a great existing wood processing infrastructure, and we've been able to retain that network of processing facilities. We're not at the capacity we need. We're still not matched to pace and scale. And so our vulnerability is also in, we have just the bare minimum of what we need, but we have more than many of the parts of the state. So that leads me really to sort of the conclusionary slide here, is that we really are a place worth investing in. We have the water, we have the carbon, we have the forests. We're fragile because we have small populations. and we have limitations on our workforce, but it's worth the investment for the greater good in California. So when we try to bring forward that Fire Adapted Communities framework, I'm a member of the Fire Adapted Communities framework for the task force in addition to the Science Advisory Panel. We need to have that space of innovation and that opportunity to really figure out how we stand up and retain and sustain solutions that are going to work for us with durability into the future. So with that, thank you very much for the chance to share some thoughts. And
that was fantastic. I thought you all did an exceptional job really speaking to the key issues, some of the complexities, the values at a nice resolution. I can see your face, Secretary Crowfoot, and I know you love these panels. So if you have something you're on the edge of your seat on, I do too, but I want to give you the first opportunity.
Well, really helpful, and I think it's always great to get this education and be grounded. I think a lot of people probably in the audience here or watching on the internet know these issues intuitively because they live them day to day. But for those of us who are not from this region, I think it's really helpful for us to get the full understanding. I mean, my takeaway was that we've got an incredibly rich place in this region, whether it's environmentally, culturally, water. We've got real challenges as a result of the changing climate. I learned something around the fact that our rivers are going to bring more sediment down as a result of less snow. So great challenges. And we need to continue to get more fire on the landscape and figure out the workforce so we can get more of this, this vegetation we need to take out of the forest, put to productive use. So for me, it's a really well-rounded base of information to spend the rest of the day talking about.
Great, thank you for that. So one of, obviously, and I'm sure it's obvious to you, timber is a big part of this region. We talked about a lot of the trade-offs, a lot of the complexities. There are multiple uses and interests in these landscapes, and you didn't see a picture of a logging deck in any of our talks, but we all recognize that's important. Or did we? Okay, my bad. I acquiesce. But I do want to ask you, Frank, if you could speak to some of those challenges, some of those conflicts that arise so that we can actually realize activities at scale to eventually safeguard these ecosystems.
All right, so as a Forest Service scientist and as a cultural community member there in the Middle Lower Klamath River, one of the greatest challenges I see is learning the perspective of how we can all work together to learn to live with fire, and that there's going to be different processes and pathways that get there. And so for a lot of the things that we can do for understory treatments, that's important at a certain level, but a lot of these, because of fire exclusion and fire suppression, a lot of the Douglas fir and pines are of a size that are fire resistant. And so in order to use fire as a tool to burn them out, you're also going to lose a lot of your legacy species and other cultural and conservation values. So having the integration of the knowledge, I say overcome the challenge about what are your values, how do you look at how you approach a prescription or a strategy that addresses that, and then looking at a way that you can use all the tools in the toolbox, some of them which are still developing, to essentially have a restoration byproduct like saw logs or usable timber that also promotes your diversity, like your hardwoods, your other pines, and a more open and resilient forest, but also workforce and educated community that can do that work into the future.
Thank you. That was perfect. I think that's an important point to start to unpack a little bit that we get at, because it's not lost on us. It's not lost on any of you. John, in a bit, is going to speak to how you can address some of those complexities through some of the a lot of the resources that have been developed by the task force for the end users, folks like yourselves. But I want to then go to you, Sifik, because running a climate hub, being a co-author on the fifth national climate assessment that was mentioned at the top of the hour that's soon to come out. Water and water security across the West it wasn't the gorilla in the room. We knew it was. It was the shouting person say, hey, this matters, right? We've seen demonstrations globally where communities have lost their forests. And they're still communities. They still function. They're still a society. There is no example in the history of the globe that I'm aware of where that same dynamic occurred without water. So, and I'm one of those people that I probably don't seem that serious, but I take my job deathly seriously. And I, as a third generation Californian, this is the thing that wakes me up in the middle of the night. And it should be the thing that we're all working towards solving. So with what Frank just shared, could you talk to us about how do we negotiate these implementations, these partnerships, so that we can ensure that we're getting, for every activity on the surface, we're getting the most that we can in terms of water resources? And if you could, and I know I'm asking for a lot, mindful that we're in a period where we're gonna, we think, get about the same amount of water, but it's gonna come more as rain. And as Secretary Crowfoot has, that has other implications too. So to you, thank you.
Yeah, and I had that on my last slide, but got interrupted by the sound. But really, I think, I understand that the wildfire crisis is really a big one in front of us, and rightly so, we are trying to deal with it. But a lot of these projects, to me, as a scientist, are also the opportunity to learn from them, right? So make sure that whatever action we are taking on the ground, we are monitoring and we are learning from it, so that we can use some of that information to refine the management moving forward, right? Because the last thing we want is create another, I'm going to say this, wildfire suppression type of scenario where we have too much fuel buildup that is sitting there waiting, to be burned, right? The opposite of that, you can create something where the forest is open and those patches are big enough that start impacting our water supply, and that is already being impacted by the climate change, right? So how can we look at multiple benefits? And that's really the kind of theme that you're hearing since morning. And, John was talking about this and the resource kit, right? The multi-benefit framework. So how can we kind of bring all the different benefits that might originate, even though our focus is the wildfire risk reduction, but whether you like it or not, there are carbon benefits, there are water benefits, both the water supply and water quality, there are habitat benefits. How can we bring all of those benefits as part of the package and bring people on board that traditionally don't see the forest management as part of their portfolio, right? Because managing wildland is expensive. Who is going to pay for it, right? So if we quantify it, if we monetize it, and if we put it in the multi-benefit framework, we will get there, and we will help mitigate some of the climate crisis that is really impacting our water supply, because climate, forest, water supply, these are all connected, and if we focus on only one aspect, I think we're going to disbalance the other part of the cycle.
Yeah, thank you. I want to, and just note too, when we go into lunch and later this afternoon, there's another individual here, Dr. Roger Bales, who has worked closely with and mentored Safik earlier on. I want you just to raise your hand, Roger, because find Safik and engage them in your partnerships and your conversations. You guys can get back at me for mentioning that publicly later. It is important. It's important for all of us, and we really need that level of expertise in this region as much as anywhere else on Earth. I think we have time for one more question, and I want to turn to Yana. I want to ask you about the 2023 Smith River fire, right? That's been noted for kind of demonstrating really what that community vulnerability looks like, how the economic impacts of fires like that have shown up, and what have been some of maybe also the recovery limitations in that incident as well?
Thank you for that question. I just really want to bring this home because I know for those of us in California, we probably didn't hear that much about the Smith River fire and the Smith River complex. So a couple of things to note is that in anticipation of fire burning underneath the power lines were de-energized to the communities of Crescent City and Brookings. So that's about a population of 30,000 people that were without power, without those mainline power for almost 3.5 weeks. They had 7 days without power. Then Pacific Power brought in generators to re-energize individual substations so that the communities could get some power. Let's just think about that for a minute. This is not a power shutoff, right? This is a power shutoff because of not having redundancy, not having a backup line. And so one of my colleagues, Dr. Alec Domka, did some research to try and figure out the economic impact of that. And I just want to bring this forward. So the economic impact was reported at $1,800 per person. The average medium gross income is $2,000 a month. Think about that. So the estimated business loss at this point is $50 million for 2 small communities. So let's talk about pace and scale, and let's talk about recovery. Let's try and figure out how we can get there as quickly as we can. Now, we didn't lose any significant number of homes in that case, but the downstream effect is so significant. And it's just, I know I want to applaud all of those, especially the gentlemen from Washington, D.C., who are investing in our region, because it really matters. Really matters.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, those are sobering numbers, but they're real, right? And that's what Patrick has been great with the scientists, because he's just like, let's pull the Band-Aid off and unpack the hard questions and really grapple with them. It's not pretend they're not there, because they are there, and we recognize that. This panel I thought has been lovely. I walked outside. When I was outside coming in, I thought I was walking into a rock show. And I love a good rock show, let me tell you. But this has just been extraordinary, and I've learned a ton, and I think it's been perfect. It's a perfect setup now for the Science Advisory co-chair with me, Dr. John Battles from University of California, Berkeley, who's a forest ecology professor. So we've heard about the diversity, Ramona, and fire and climate change. We've heard about fire use. We've heard about the importance of water, community impact. Now, John's going to show us how you actually can use some of the resources in the regional resource kits for Northern California to grapple with these issues and consider and plan and implement projects to reduce risk to these ecosystems and communities of your region. Dr. Battles.
Thank you, Steve. Great, so it's really a pleasure to be here to introduce the Northern California Regional Resource Kits. Again, specific information for this region of the world. All right, just next slide. Can you do that for me? Thank you. So as Steve mentioned, the scientists are all in on helping this task force. And our charge was, in terms of going faster and going bigger, is to pull the information together, to make it accessible, and to make sure it crosses jurisdictions. Wildfires don't care about county boundaries. Drought doesn't care whether it's federal, private, or tribal land. And therefore, our data, the information, has to cross boundaries. So as my colleague Mike Goulden says, we need to get that information wall to wall. And that was our charge. And we see the secretary and we see the regional forester here, and they're super nice and gregarious and super pleasant people, but they don't get to be leaders without holding us accountable. And that's where you get that feedback from a scientist with, oh my gosh, we have a deadline that we can't miss. And so we've been trying to live up to that deadline and go with the pace and scale of the task force. Next slide, please. This, again, I want to just give a shout out to what we've called the Regional Resource Kit Interagency Science Team. These members is all part of our job to some extent, but the level of commitment and intellectual energy to get these versions out today, and our version 1.0, they're going to get better, it still was a big lift, and none of us expected 18 months ago of really what we're getting into. So I just want to acknowledge our team members and colleagues and sort of appreciate their effort. There's Pat Manley, there's Mike Goulden, Tadashi Moody, Carol Clark, and then of course Peter Stein, who's been the project manager for this effort, and I really just want to appreciate their effort. And then the collegiality of meeting deadlines and again, trying to work through these issues going forward. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to talk about, we fit into this resource kit, we think of it as the wheel. We're really focused on 2 aspects. I'm going to talk about the metrics, and then later on I'm going to talk about how you can use those metrics to do assessments and set priorities. Next slide, please. And so here's a picture of what you've heard a lot about this, the natural resources of this region, the sort of the huge value of these resources. We have really unique and some of the most intact salmonid resources on the map on the left, and we have a lot of forest cover here, the classic big tree forest of California here. So this is really a resource-rich area. But one of our charges was to pull this together in a comprehensive package, to get information that is both scientifically rigorous but also management relevant. It does not matter if we scientists think we have the greatest thing since sliced bread if the managers don't believe and use it. At the same time, we don't want managers to use information that's not robust. So it really is this balance between management relevance and scientific integrity. At the same time, we also want things at a 30-meter scale, and we want it at a sort of a time frame where it can be updated as things change. So we really focused on data that we had at that 30-meter scale, and that could be updated potentially annually. And so you can see that here, really valuable, not just to know that there's a lot of resources in this area, but where are they? Where are the hotspots? Where are the concentrations to inform planning going forward? Next slide, please. As we've heard before, the northern region here provides enormous ecosystem services to the state. The water sources here are just incredibly important. But again, in this map on the left, you can see where are those hotspots? Where is that water really being produced? At the same time, these forests also store an enormous amount of carbon that helps California meet its greenhouse gas emission criteria. And again, you can look on this map and figure out where they are. So when you're planning treatments in your particular region, you know where these resources are. Next slide, please. At the same time, we've been hearing about this again and again. These resources, these services, these communities are under threat. They're threatened by, again, wildfire and drought. One of the key priorities, sort of universal consensus among the scientific advisory panel is that if you're going to try and do one thing right now, what we need to do is prevent high severity fire. And that's what you see on this left map. What is the probability of high severity fire? We really want to prevent that really negative kind of fire coming on the landscape. We know fire is part of this landscape, but not high severity fire. At the same time, we also have a really big risk with all of these dense productive forests that are used to a lot of rainfall, the consequences of a drought. And we're really there. You can see a lot of high severity areas here that are at very high risk of drought. Next slide, please. And of course, again, we've been talking about the community impacts, that we really need to protect communities. This is a rural area, but it's a diverse area. It has a high concentration of indigenous peoples. And we get to think beyond just the direct risk of wildfire coming into communities, because wildfires in the region produce an enormous amount of smoke. And so this map on the right shows what's the potential for smoke production from a high severity fire. And you can see, again, a lot of these hot spots of high smoke line up on many of our communities in this region. And so you have to, again, think of those, not just the direct impacts of wildfire, but also these other consequences of wildfire as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's sort of, and I think we have 99 metrics for the North Coast. We're going to add probably one more in our revision coming up soon. So there's a lot of metrics here. How do you take those metrics and use them to assess and prioritize? Next slide, please. One of the great things we rolled out at the last meeting is the interagency treatment tracker system. So right now in this system, we have all the 222 projects up there, 2022 projects up there, and they're color coded. The key codes to think of is that red is beneficial fire and blue is sort of hand or mechanical thinning. I picked two places in the northern region here to sort of think about it. One is Scotts Valley on the left. The other is Weaverville. You can see some similarities in the strategy and some differences. Again, one of the priorities here, we've heard about it from the Forest Service, is this wildfire crisis strategy. We need to protect communities from wildfire. And you see this in both Scotts Valley and Weaverville, where these treatments, these polygons, these spatially explicit polygons are showing you where the work was done in 2022. And you can see it sort of lining outside on the perimeters of these communities to prevent wildfire from the wildlands getting into the communities. But if you look at these, there's big differences. Why is Scotts Valley has a lot more beneficial fire? They're using prescribed fire to get that kind of fuel reduction. Where in Weaverville, you see a lot more of mechanical and hand thinning. So what are some of the reasons for that? Why might that be happening? Next slide, please. So I'm going to kind of take you a walk. I'm going to walk you through sort of a Weaverville example, sort of a planning treatment. And again, I'm taking this from sort of an analytical point of view. I wasn't involved in designing these treatments. I'm looking at the data, trying to see, how does this work in sense of meeting some of these multiple priorities we have in the landscape. So here's Weaverville. We're looking at here. You can see as you look around Weaverville, there's a whole bunch of treatments, but most of these treatments are mechanical and hand thinning. I'm going to focus on, look at two of them, one in the upper left and one in the lower right, these two different regions. Next slide, please. So here's a map of this high severity fire, with the yellow being sort of the very high severity fire, the stuff you want to avoid. You can see within Weaverville proper, there's not much, but a lot of these mountainous areas around there do have them. And in Weaverville, most of these treatments were either hand thinning, which is on the top, or mastication, which is that where we use that masticator on the bottom to sort of chow up small trees and fuel. So that's what mechanical and hand thinning means. So let's overlay the next slide, please. So here they're overlaid on top of this. And that one in the upper left is along a ridge line. It was done with mastication. It's clearly meant to be a fuel break to prevent fire from coming up over the ridge. The lower blob, the big block in the lower right, was against a whole slope. It started at the ridge and went down into the sort of the river bottom. Again, all hand treated, very carefully hand treated to kind of reduce the sort of wildfire hazard there. Next slide, please. This same region, it also happens to be really, really good high suitability habitat for the Pacific fisher. The Pacific fisher is a sensitive and threatened species. They have to come into the planning. We need to protect both our people and our habitats for wildlife. Ramona mentioned this earlier. You can see that almost surrounding Weaverville, not only do they have a lot of sort of fire risk, high severity fire risk, but also a lot of good Pacific fisher habitat. And some of these fuel treatments are not all that great for Pacific fisher population. So how do you manage those two trade-offs? Next slide, please. Again, here it is. Here are these same polygons of treatments placed on top of another metric, in this case, Pacific fisher wild habitat suitability. And you can see, it begins to give you some idea, at least when I'm looking at this, maybe in this region, this lighter touch, this sort of, rather than using prescribed fire, let's go in there with hand thinning so we don't disturb the Pacific fisher population so much. It might be a more acceptable way, a more reasonable way of doing it. That's just me looking at it. Now, one of the key things to think that this is just 2022, and this is roughly a 2020 sort of metrics. As we go forward, we're going to be able to put 2023 information on there. We're going to be able to put 2024. We're going to be able to start seeing how we assemble all of these different polygons. We can also, hopefully, we'll refresh this data so we can come back and see how effective was it? Have we started to change these things? Have we adversely affected Pacific fisher habitat? Have we improved sort of the wildfire hazard situation there? So we have a lot of information going to local communities. We have differences. Scotts Valley approaches it differently from Weaverville. In my conversations this morning, I met a colleague who grew up in Weaverville, and she said, it might not have anything to do with Pacific fisher, John. It might be the fact that Weaverville has been kind of traumatized by wildfire, and therefore they prefer to use mechanical and hand thinning. That's a totally legitimate way. That's part of what the task force is trying to do. We need to push these information. We want to give people information so they can make choices that fit for their community while also meeting these multiple objectives. And that's really the goal of this information going forward. And we're going to continue to build it and make it better as we go forward. We're committed to, we want your feedback, use the data. Next slide, please. Here's how you get it. But as you use it and find flaws, you want other things, please contact us, and we're committed to making it better. The task force is committing to continually making this better so that information is out there so we can meet our goals of pace and scale. Thank you.
We also realize we're holding you between lunch, and I'm a big guy. I don't like to miss lunch. That was outstanding. Thank you, Dr. Battles. This is a toolkit. That QR code takes you to a toolkit. I will close by sharing that we recognize, and Julianne mentioned this, and I believe Patrick mentioned this as well, that we can't just put it on the web page and hope it gets used. We are assembling a team to come to you and where we will develop a workshop and work you through these resources so you can become familiar and more fluent with them. And when we've done this in the other regions, we've even provided lunch. So with that, I'm going to turn to you, Jen and Wade, and thank you all for having us.
Thanks so much. It's an incredible body of work you guys have created. The way I think about it is we need to do a lot of things to expand these projects to protect our communities and our landscapes. We need more funding. We need permit streamlining. We need enough bodies to do the work. But we also need the information that informs that. And I think when we were working over the last couple of years, we said, God, wouldn't it be a disaster if we're asking every local or regional group to come up with this information themselves? Everybody reinventing the wheel. This is a complicated situation. Better to identify, what we want these projects to do, and then identify the different, characteristics or dimensions of these landscapes. So the goal here is to have that one-stop shop for information. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't mean the work gets done. It doesn't even mean the work that gets done right, but it's a key component. And I'm really thankful to the Science Advisory Panel, of which you all serve on, for providing this. And as John said, it's a 1.0 version. And so to Steve's point, we want to understand how groups are using this and how they can use it better, and how we can package the information to use it better. Because we want it to be one less thing that local groups have to put together to actually get projects on the ground. Jen, any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, thanks. I agree. Just one less barrier that we can, relieve people of. So this is our 4th resource kit. So just really quickly, John or Steve particularly, any reflections from this past year and the other resource kits that have been out there that would be helpful for everybody who may be looking at using? Hopefully you guys go back and use this. Any advice, even as they launch into these resource kits now that they're available? Anything you would advise users?
Yeah, I mean, we've been a part of the we have been involved in developing the workshops for the different entities to just become familiar with these things, right? Otherwise, you're just kind of handing a suitcase and you have no idea what the contents are. Here, we're actually sitting down with entities, letting them get familiar with them, work through scenarios, right? If this, then, what data would you go to? How would you interpret those data? And I've shared this before, Peter Stein and I drove up together. John and I have had this conversation. I've had it with Sherry Hazelhurst, Julianne. We all know that it's just as there was an interagency science team that was, all hands on deck to get this stuff going together on time consistently. We have to do the same thing to support these groups, right? And because these are some complex data and the interpretations are complex. They're usable, they're publicly available, you can get them now, but we want to continue that support. And those have been really well received. So we realize we've gotten to, where we've gotten to, it's like John says a lot, it's 1.0, and the data are going to continue to improve, but we also want to be there to support the groups in the long term. John?
And also, I just would point out as a field scientist, this does not replace the knowledge you have on the ground. It's meant to help and guide, but not replace. And so we know that people know their forests, they know their landscapes, and we just want to help them put into a larger content and go faster, as the Secretary and Regional Forester say. We want to remove one less barrier.
Perfect.
Let me just make a really quick point on that, because we do hear from people throughout the state. We know what we're doing. We know where the high priority landscapes are. Just write us checks. I mean, people literally are saying that. There's a lot of money out there. What I hope people could understand from this is it'll not only help you better prioritize and plan projects, but it gives us information to help the money keep rolling. It's not enough for you to hear you've treated a high priority project. We want to know is, what are the carbon storage benefits? What are the water benefits? What's the reduction in fire risk? We're hearing from everybody. Please get beyond acres treated. So a whole nother benefit of these tools is giving us and giving the federal side and appropriators. If you give us another $1 billion, here's what we're going to get in terms of safer communities, more carbon storage, more biodiversity. Once we add this stuff up, it'll be a powerful tool, not just for you, but for us to go to Congress and the legislature to say, your money is working and here's how it's working. So I just want to make sure that you folks keep in mind that it's working both ways, planning and prioritizing, but also reporting, because we do have joint accountability here. We're willing to go regional, but you got to demonstrate that you can handle us going regional and can generate the information to help sell a continued regional approach as we move forward. So thank everybody for helping with that.
And Patrick, maybe the last comment before we break for lunch is, by going regional, the notion is getting funding into the regions, and then the regional leaders and groups are deciding where that funding is made. The traditional approach is for somebody in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. to look through hundreds of projects and then to pick the specific projects in each place. We don't think that works well because, one, as I said, we don't know these landscapes as well as local groups do, but then also we want to develop this pipeline of projects and scale up those projects that can happen. And if it's somebody in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. picking every specific project, it's not going to work. So to Patrick's point, the benefit of this information is it helps us report on the outcomes of each of these projects, which is really, really important. And by having a one-stop shop for information, you're not spending months trying to identify what your projects will do. You're actually using this information to spit out information about what the projects will achieve. So we think it's going to actually accelerate projects and help us shift to this paradigm where we're pushing more funding to the regions, that the regions are then deciding on the projects. So with that said, after lunch, we're going to get into, okay, what's working, what's not, and how are we going to do more of this more quickly? So I think we're going to break for lunch. Know that in the back of your name tag, you have a ticket. That ticket gets you a lunch. And use this opportunity for the next 50 minutes to meet new people, build connections, and we'll be back here promptly at 1:30.
Thank you, panel.